competition is extremely competitive among the local government officials because you are competing with other mayor for a top job, right? So you need to do better than them. And then the central government got really kind of concerned and even angry and frustrated. So they decided to put that as a penalizing factor. And then guess what happened? Well, actually, environmental protection sped up, and in the matter of short few years, I see blue skies every day in Beijing. Innovation, unicorns have kind of been an implicit yardstick for local governments. That's kind of how we've seen these great, EV companies, 80 cities doing EVs. I mean, do we really need 80 cities to do their own EVs, right? Because ultimately, the state is not the best at allocating resources, picking winners. You want the private actors, whether it's the venture funds or through market competition, to ultimately decide who gets the most resources.
So maybe can you speak to that? What are some important things to understand about the structure of the Chinese state?
Well, the central leadership politically is extremely powerful and it's very consolidated, but they hold a very crucial key to the local governments, which is that they decide their fate. Am I going to promote them? Am I going to put them in jail? Am I going to fire them? Am I going to reward them? Am I going to punish them? They hold that crucial key. And I think what was, very surprising for most of the Western audience is that when I mentioned about the mayor economy, there's why don't our American mayors in each city do these very radical things and then push for GDP growth and technology and innovation? It's quite different. I think this is where China's very unique in the world, is that political centralization, economic decentralization, and the yardstick to measure local mayors' competence through, in the first stage, it was GDP growth. So I am a mayor of, the city of Nanjing in Jiangsu province. I'm going to peek at my neighbors' mayors' city's GDP growth, and I'm going to be very, very competitive. By the way, I forgot about that. Competition is extremely competitive among the local government officials because you are competing with other mayor for a top job, right? So you need to do better than them. And whether that was efficient structure or not, I cannot comment, but it certainly just fueled this massive and rapid expansion, economic expansion. First, it was industrialization. Everybody wanted to do exports. Then they discovered, oh my gosh, we can have so much fiscal revenues coming from land, right? Selling land and real estate. Let's build real estate and let's urbanize. And then the money kept coming into these local governments, and that they can spend it on nurturing more companies or supporting real estate or supporting investment, and they can do a better job. So then it was geared towards real estate, and that's how the property cycle became the big thing. Everything was at double speed because of what the local government's incentives were designed to do. I say now that China's biggest challenge is consumption, right? It's not production. We know that China is very, very competitive in production and supply. China needs to be a consuming country to be a rich country. Why don't you put consumption as part of the yardstick for measuring local governments? For a while it was environmental protection. Guess what? Very few of them really want to do it seriously because it goes against the incentives of driving growth, right? They would suffer on GDP growth if they were very serious about environmental protection. So for a couple years, nothing happened in China on that front. And then the central government got really kind of concerned and even angry and frustrated. So they decided to put that as a penalizing factor. And then guess what happened? Well, actually, environmental protection sped up, and in the matter of short few years, I see blue skies every day in Beijing. That's how it works.
So GDP is a measure of success in production. What's the measure, or what does it mean to be successful on the consumer side? You said it's important to improve that. What does it mean to be a successful consumer nation?
The metrics shouldn't be geared just towards growth alone, GDP growth alone. It was just singular GDP growth, and you can borrow heavily and just spend on infrastructure. That's not a productive way to drive the economy. And that's what the local governments were doing for a long period of time. In the last few years, innovation, unicorns have kind of been an implicit yardstick for local governments. That's kind of how we've seen these great, EV companies, 80 cities doing EVs. I mean, do we really need 80 cities to do their own EVs, right? Solar panels, now DeepSeek has become, a star. Semiconductor companies, each local government wants to have their own national champion. So implicitly, technology was part of the yardstick competition as well. But if you can more accurately have a metric for consumption measures, really focus on, making sure that it's coming from consumption, this GDP growth, rather than from investment or infrastructure, then I think that it might focus the government's objective a bit more on thinking about how to make people feel more secure so that they want to save more. For instance, creating more jobs. For instance, more on social security spending, on healthcare, on elderly care. Because for the longest period of time, this political economy model was brilliant at scaling up supply. But it was extremely weak at raising personal consumption because the incentive does not lie in consumption, it lies in production. So you shift the objectives a little bit, and maybe the local government will do more to stimulate consumption.
Okay, you mentioned the mayor economy. That seems like an incredibly powerful idea. And you also mentioned that perhaps you're not sure exactly how perfectly efficient it is and what efficiency there means. How good are you at quickly figuring out the best ideas? That's what an efficient market does. There's a kind of component to what you're saying where you're a little bit critical of, do you really need 80 EV companies? But maybe you do. It seems like an incredible thing to do, right? So what are the pros and cons of this? Maybe you could speak to it a little bit more.
I think it depends on the timing. If you're starting a new emerging strategic sector like EVs or batteries or solar panels, you need the local governments to be involved, to mobilize, right? The big push to coordinate the supply chains. If you wait for the markets to develop over time, it's going to take a long time. Maybe they don't even want to do it, right? Look at the US. The US is very, very behind on some of the new strategic sectors. But once you've reached a certain level of market competition, I think the state needs to withdraw or to retreat because ultimately the state is not the best at allocating resources, picking winners. You want the private actors, whether it's the venture funds or through market competition, to ultimately decide who gets the most resources. But in the beginning, that big push is not really in any of the canonical models that I've studied in economics in the Western school of thought. State push, state mobilization, state initiation, that's not there. But I think if you look at EVs, solar panels, even just thinking about the idea of reforms in the first place, that initial state push was vitally important. The other negative, although I think by and large positive aspect, is I don't think that we need 80 cities to do their own EV brands, but to get started, maybe that's what it would have taken to drive that incentive. And then ultimately, it's up to the market to decide who are the last five remaining EV companies, right, through market mechanisms. That's Chinese style industrial policy. Industrial policy was heavily criticized. And again, if I talk to my Harvard professors, they will be very, very, very skeptical about the role of the state, especially in such a major way. But if you look at the Chinese experience, the evidence for success is all there. The cities that have pushed the most on supporting that particular sector ultimately did the best in terms of production, but also in terms of innovation, measured by patents. It's all in the data. But the downside is that a lot of the capital is wasted. And this is what I also discussed in my book, is that it is inefficient, although maybe it's necessary. The amount of waste of investment, plowed into these companies that will ultimately just go under, but also the misallocation of resources because it's led by the state, are some of the downsides. But I guess on balance, it's been positive because look at China's internal combustion engine effort. Nothing, right? Semiconductors. Thanks to Biden, thanks to Trump, it's improved dramatically. But all these things that they tried to do before, they couldn't do. But when it's a new thing, like something that there's no incumbent, no particular advantage in any country, actually China is really spearheading these sectors.
Can we linger a little bit more on this mayor economy? It just seems like such a powerful thing where one mayor looks over to the next and looks even just a trivially simple number like the GDP. Why don't we do that in the United States or in the West more? Just compete on GDP.
Well, you need to be elected and reelected, right? Is that what your electoral base cares about, right? In China, it's what the central government, your boss, cares about. If you ask the consumers, they rather you spend on social spending, right? The things we talked about that stimulates consumption, on education, on healthcare, things that stimulate demand. So
Yeah.
it's a difference of the political system.
So maybe can you speak to the difference? Another difference is the long-term multi-generational thinking that permeates Chinese culture. So how does that differ from the West, sort of the Western style capitalism of quarterly focused thinking?
The Chinese are both the most patient and the most short-termist economic actors I met. The patience I don't need to explain because I think the political continuity means that they can make plans for 2 decades ahead, right? Even longer. The investment of Chinese parents in their children is a multi-decade long project, and they save. Chinese people love to save because they think that they'll have even more money if they save that money rather than spend it on a ski vacation. So that I think it's patently obvious to most people around the world. But I think that most of them would not have known that there's a very popular motto in China, which is called short, flat, fast. That's the impatient part of the Chinese culture, especially with respect to the economy. Short, flat, fast was used to describe a winning volleyball strategy that eventually became adapted to describing the society as a whole and economic decision making.
Nice.
If you're an investor, you only want to invest in things that you can quickly turn around, make a lot of money, and don't need to do much work. It also applies to marriages. So, a short courtship, a very flat emotional relationship, and a fast divorce. That that is how
Uh,
you see these companies rise. Within a very short period of time. Of course, investors are only interested in those companies that can turn around and exit in a very short period of time, making many, many multiples. And so, in that sense, people are very, very impatient, right? I sit on some boards of these long-standing companies, and the values are just so different. Even though a lot of these public companies are constrained by the quarterly results and so forth, but the values are about sustaining something, a company, for a long time, thinking about organic growth, thinking about investments for the future, sustainability. Maybe it's that competition, maybe it's the speed that we're used to in China. People think about short. So, this dichotomy is very, very interesting.
that's surprising to me.
Yeah, well,
It's
this
a
is
surprising idea, right? So that there is a kind of in the West conception of Chinese culture, Chinese economy that everything is usually 50, 100, 200 years out. You have this long vision. But you're basically saying that there's a deep, in the business sector, impatience about everything.
that's a transitory phenomenon, I'd say. But if you look at the cheaper stuff, poor quality, that's a reflection of that. The copying, it's the same kind of mentality. Just get ahead quickly. But again, that is all shifting. That is all shifting because China is now in a different stage of development. If you ask the younger generation, they really care about quality. They care about values. And these companies, these very successful companies, successful in 5 years, 10 years, found themselves in a very difficult position after a longer period of time. So that short, flat, fast attitude, which was so popular, especially before the pandemic, that's actually somewhat disappearing. So in some sense, this economic downturn is not that bad for China because it made the Chinese realize that it's not always going to go up, and it made them really look down deeper into what they really should be focused on. That there will be cycles, there will be up and downs, and so these very short-termist thinking and opportunistic way of driving business will ultimately fail. It's bad for China that we're having a sustained economic softness, sustained economic softness, but I think it's also a very, very important lesson for the Chinese people to go through.